Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe, the place where we explore important global topics and help you improve your English step by step using real-world news and clear, simple explanations. My name is Adam, and as always, I'm joined by my thoughtful and insightful co-host, Julia. Today's episode begins with a situation that has quietly caught the attention of people, journalists, and analysts around the world. Not because of loud speeches or dramatic announcements, but because of something much more subtle, movement in the sky. Recently, reports about U.S. military aircraft operating near Iran have appeared in international news. And naturally, many people started asking the same question. Is this a warning signal, or is it simply a routine military move?
Hello everyone, I'm Julia, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. Like Adam said, today's topic may sound serious at first, but don't worry. Our goal is not to create fear or confusion. Instead, we are here to explain everything calmly, clearly, and step by step, especially for English learners who want to understand global news without feeling overwhelmed. When people hear phrases like US aircraft and near Iran, their minds often jump to conclusions. But in this episode, we will slow things down, look at the facts, and focus on understanding rather than guessing.
That's right, Julia. In today's fast-moving digital world, a single headline or short video can travel across the globe in seconds, and suddenly, millions of people are talking about the same event without fully understanding what actually happened. When news broke about U.S. aircraft activity in the region around Iran, social media platforms quickly filled with opinions, questions, and emotional reactions. Some people saw it as a strong political message, while others wondered if it was just another normal military operation that happens more often than we realize. This is exactly why this topic matters right now, because understanding the difference between appearance and reality is more important than ever.
Exactly, Adam. And this is also why this topic is perfect for an educational podcast like ours. Global politics and military movements can sound complex, but when we break them into simple ideas and clear language, they become much easier to understand. Many learners tell us that they want to follow international news in English, but they feel nervous because the language feels too difficult or the topic feels too heavy. Today, we want to show you that you can learn English and understand world events at the same time, without stress and without fear.
Before we go any further, I want to make something very clear for all our listeners. This podcast is educational. We are not predicting conflict, we are not supporting any political side, and we are not spreading rumors. Our purpose is to analyze what is publicly known, explain why such movements attract attention, and help you understand how experts usually think about these situations. Everything you hear in this episode is shared for learning and discussion, especially to help you improve your English listening and comprehension skills using real news topics.
That clarification is very important, Adam. Sometimes people confuse analysis with speculation, but there is a big difference between the two. Speculation is about guessing what might happen, often without evidence, while analysis is about understanding what is happening now and why people are paying attention to it. In this episode, we will focus on analysis only. We will talk about why aircraft movements are noticed, how such actions are usually interpreted, and why they don't automatically mean that something dangerous is about to happen.
Exactly. Now let's think about why aircraft movements, especially near sensitive regions, attract so much global attention. Military aircraft are not like commercial planes that carry passengers from one country to another. They are symbols of national security, defense planning, and international presence. When people hear that such aircraft are operating near a country like Iran, which already has a complex relationship with the United States, it naturally raises questions. But questions are not the same as conclusions, and this episode is about helping you understand those questions calmly and clearly.
And it's also important to remember that many military activities happen every day without becoming news. Training flights, patrol missions, and routine deployments are part of how modern militaries operate. However, when these activities happen in regions that are often discussed in international politics, journalists, and analysts, pay closer attention. This doesn't mean something bad is happening. It simply means the situation is being observed more carefully. As learners, this gives us a great opportunity to learn new vocabulary and understand how international news is reported in English.
That's a great point, Julia. Words like presence, deployment, routine, and signaling appear often in news reports. And by the end of this episode, you'll feel much more comfortable hearing and using them. But more importantly, you'll learn how to listen to global news with a balanced mindset. Instead of reacting emotionally to headlines, you'll be able to pause, think, and ask the right questions, such as, what do we know for sure? What is normal in this situation? And what are experts actually saying?
And as we move through this podcast, we'll guide you gently through each part of the discussion. We'll explain the background, the reasons such movements happen, and why governments sometimes use military presence as communication rather than confrontation. We'll also talk about the role of media and why some stories feel bigger or more dramatic than they really are. All of this will be explained in simple, clear English, so you can focus on learning and understanding, not worrying.
So, dear listeners, if you've seen headlines or heard conversations about U.S. aircraft near Iran and felt confused or unsure about what it really means, you're in the right place. Today's episode is designed to give you clarity, context, and confidence, not fear. And as always, if you're enjoying this podcast and finding it helpful for your English learning journey, don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the English Globe. Your support helps us continue creating educational content just like this.
Yes, and we'd also love to hear from you. You can share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. Remember, learning English through real news is one of the best ways to improve your understanding and confidence. Stay with us as we move into the next part of the episode, where we'll start breaking down what was actually observed and why it caught the world's attention.
All right then, let's take a deep breath, stay curious, and move forward together. In the next section, we'll begin with the basic facts and explain what people really noticed about these aircraft movements, using calm language and clear explanations. Let's continue. Now that we've set the tone for today's episode, let's move carefully and calmly into the next step of our discussion, which is understanding what was actually observed and reported. Because before we can analyze meaning or intention, we must first be very clear about the basic facts, and this is especially important when we are learning English through real news, where headlines can sometimes sound dramatic, even when the situation itself is controlled and routine.
That's a great place to start, Adam, because many listeners hear a headline and immediately imagine something much bigger than what really happened. So in this section, we'll focus only on what people saw, what was officially reported, and what words like near Iran really mean, using simple English and clear explanations, so everyone can follow along comfortably.
Exactly, Julia. According to public reports from international media and official statements, observers noticed U.S. military aircraft operating in the broader Middle East region, an area where the United States has long maintained a military presence for security, monitoring, and cooperation with regional partners, and these aircraft movements were detected through normal tracking systems that journalists, analysts, and even civilians often use to follow military aviation activity.
Let me pause here and simplify that a little for our learners. When Adam says observers, he means journalists, analysts, and sometimes independent researchers who watch military activity using public tools. And when he says military presence, he means that US forces are already active in this region as part of long-term operations, not because of a new emergency.
That's a very helpful clarification, Julia. One important detail is that these aircraft were not reported to be flying inside Iran's airspace. Instead, they were operating in international airspace, or in the airspace of neighboring countries, which is a normal and legal practice under international law, and this is why experts emphasize the word near, because it refers to the region around Iran, not the country itself.
This point is extremely important for understanding the situation. The word near does not mean inside, and it does not mean crossing borders. In geography and international reporting, near Iran usually means areas like the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, or airspace over allied countries, all of which are locations where military aircraft from several nations are commonly present.
Yes, and when we talk about the types of aircraft involved, reports usually describe surveillance planes, refueling aircraft, or fighter jets that are part of routine patrols and monitoring missions, and none of the confirmed information suggests emergency deployment, sudden escalation, or preparation for immediate action, which is why experts urge the public to separate confirmed movements from emotional interpretations.
For English learners, this is a great moment to learn an important word: deployment. Deployment means the movement or positioning of military forces for a specific purpose. A deployment can be routine, planned, and peaceful in nature, and it does not always mean something dangerous is about to happen. Another useful word here is presence, which simply means being in a place over a period of time.
That's right, Julia. In fact, the U.S. military has openly stated many times that its aircraft regularly operate in the Middle East as part of regional security missions, training exercises, and intelligence gathering, all of which are conducted according to established schedules and agreements with partner countries. And these activities often happen without attracting public attention unless the political context makes people more alert.
And this is where media headlines play an important role. Some headlines focus on location and timing in a way that sounds dramatic, while the detailed reports explain that the movements were routine and expected. For learners, it's useful to understand that headlines are designed to catch attention, while the full article usually provides balance and context.
Exactly. For example, a headline might say, U.S. aircraft spotted near Iran, which is technically true, but it doesn't explain how often such flights happen, how far away they actually were, or whether anything unusual occurred, and this lack of detail can lead readers to assume danger when the facts themselves do not support that conclusion.
Let's highlight another helpful word here: region. A region is a large area that includes several countries or locations. When news reports mention the region, they are often talking about the Middle East as a whole, not one single country. Understanding this word helps learners avoid misunderstanding the scale of an event.
That's a very important language point, Julia. Now, when analysts looked at the timing of these aircraft movements, they noted that they matched existing operational patterns, meaning the flights occurred along known routes, used standard aircraft types, and followed procedures that are consistent with long-standing military practices in the area.
In simpler terms, this means nothing looked sudden or unusual to experts who regularly study military activity. The planes were not doing something completely new, and there were no confirmed reports of aggressive maneuvers or direct confrontation. This is why professionals describe the situation as observed activity rather than escalation.
Another key distinction we need to make is between what is confirmed and what is discussed online. Confirmed information comes from official statements, reliable news agencies, and consistent tracking data, while speculation often comes from social media posts that use emotional language or dramatic images without explaining the full context.
For learners, this is a great lesson not only in English, but also in critical thinking. Words like reported, confirmed, and, according to officials, usually signal reliable information, while phrases like some people say or it looks like often introduce opinion rather than fact.
Well said, Julia. So, to summarize the basic facts clearly and calmly, U.S. military aircraft were observed operating in the Middle East region, in areas that are geographically close to Iran, but not inside Iranian airspace, and these movements matched normal patterns of military presence that have existed for many years.
And importantly, there was no official confirmation of emergency action, no announcement of new military operations, and no evidence that these movements alone represented a sudden change in policy. Understanding this helps listeners stay informed without feeling alarmed.
This is exactly why starting with facts matters so much. When we understand what was actually observed, we can move forward and discuss possible interpretations in a balanced way, instead of reacting emotionally to incomplete information, which is something we'll continue to practice throughout this podcast.
And as English learners, this section helps you build confidence in listening to global news. You're learning how to separate facts from headlines, how to understand key vocabulary, and how to stay calm while following serious topics in another language, which is a very powerful skill.
In the next section, we'll take this foundation and explore why the United States operates aircraft in this region in the first place, looking at long-term presence and routine missions, again using simple language and clear explanations, so you can keep improving both your knowledge and your English.
Yes, stay with us because everything we discuss builds step by step. You're doing great so far, and this is exactly how real learning happens, slowly, clearly, and with understanding.
To understand why the United States operates military aircraft in the Middle East, we need to step back and look at the bigger historical picture, because this presence did not begin suddenly or because of one single event, but instead developed slowly over many decades as a result of global trade routes, energy security, regional partnerships, and the responsibility the U.S. took on after World War II to help maintain stability in areas that are economically and strategically important to the entire world, especially regions that connect Europe, Asia, and Africa.
Adam, when you say military presence, some learners might imagine soldiers or aircraft appearing suddenly because of danger. So could you explain in very simple terms what a long-term military presence really means and how it is different from an emergency situation or a sudden military action that happens during a crisis?
That's a very important question, Julia, because a long-term military presence means that forces, including aircraft, ships, and personnel, are already positioned in a region for years or even decades under formal agreements with partner countries, allowing regular patrols, training missions, and monitoring activities to happen calmly and predictably, which is very different from crisis actions that involve rapid movement, public warnings, or urgent deployments that are clearly described by governments as responses to immediate threats.
So, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that many US aircraft flights in this region are planned far in advance, follow fixed routes, and happen regularly, meaning they are part of a normal security system rather than a reaction to one specific country or one sudden political situation.
Exactly, Julia, and to make this even clearer for our listeners, the Middle East has been important to global security mainly because it contains major shipping routes and energy supplies that many countries depend on, so the U.S., along with its allies, has worked for decades to protect these routes by maintaining patrols and surveillance operations that help ensure trade flows safely, and misunderstandings between countries are reduced through visibility rather than secrecy.
That explanation really helps, especially for English learners, because it shows that the word patrol does not mean looking for a fight, but instead means watching an area regularly to make sure everything is calm and predictable, which is similar to how police patrol neighborhoods to prevent problems rather than to create them.
That comparison is very useful, Julia, because routine military patrols function in a similar way by showing presence without aggression, and in this region, the U.S. often operates alongside allies through joint exercises and shared monitoring systems, which helps build trust between partner countries and reduces the risk of misunderstanding, especially in areas where many different nations operate ships and aircraft close to one another.
Some learners may still wonder why aircraft are used so often instead of only ships or bases on land. So could you explain why aircraft are such an important part of routine operations and long-term security planning in this region?
Of course, Julia, aircraft are essential because they can cover very large areas quickly, collect information from a distance, support maritime patrols, and respond to unexpected situations without crossing borders or violating international rules, which makes them ideal tools for maintaining awareness and stability rather than confrontation, especially in regions with wide seas, deserts, and international airspace shared by many countries.
That makes sense, and it also helps learners understand the difference between awareness and aggression, because simply being present in the air does not mean preparing for conflict, but often means observing, communicating, and making sure that activities in the region remain transparent and predictable.
Yes, and this distinction between routine operations and crisis actions is extremely important, because during a real crisis, governments usually make clear announcements, increase diplomatic communication, and visibly change military behavior, while routine operations continue quietly in the background and only become news when people look at them through a political lens rather than a historical one.
So, when learners hear news about aircraft movements, it's helpful for them to ask whether officials are calling it an emergency or simply describing it as part of ongoing operations, because that difference in language often tells us more than the headline itself.
That's exactly right, Julia. And for decades, the U.S. presence in the Middle East has followed patterns that experts can recognize easily, which is why many analysts emphasize context instead of emotion, reminding the public that routine patrols, training missions, and cooperative security efforts are designed to reduce tension, not increase it, even though they sometimes attract attention when regional politics become more sensitive.
This discussion is really helpful for English learners, because it shows how understanding background information makes news feel less confusing and less frightening. And it also teaches them to listen carefully to words like routine, long-term, and allied, which often signal stability rather than danger.
Exactly, Julia. And as we move forward in this podcast, everything we discuss will continue to build on this foundation, helping our listeners understand not only why aircraft operate in this region, but also how to listen to international news calmly, logically, and confidently in English, without jumping to conclusions or feeling overwhelmed by complex global topics. When people hear the phrase warning signal in relation to military activity, their minds often jump immediately to the idea of conflict or danger, but in international relations, a warning signal usually means something far less dramatic and far more controlled, because countries often communicate with each other through visible actions instead of words, using things like aircraft movements, naval patrols, or joint exercises to show awareness and readiness without crossing into aggression. And this type of communication is designed to be noticed, but not to cause panic or provoke a direct response.
Let me translate that into simpler, everyday language for our listeners, because this idea can sound complex at first, but it's actually very logical, since military signaling is a bit like body language between countries, where one country might stand up straighter or move closer to show it is paying attention without shouting or starting an argument. And the goal is often to say, we are watching, we are prepared, and we want stability, rather than we want a fight, which is why understanding tone and context is so important.
Exactly, Julia. And when aircraft are involved in this kind of signaling, their presence alone can send a message without any hostile action, because aircraft can be seen, tracked, and recognized easily, making them useful tools for visibility rather than secrecy. And when they operate in international airspace or established patrol zones, they are essentially reminding other actors in the region that monitoring is ongoing, rules are being followed, and sudden surprises are less likely, which actually helps reduce misunderstandings rather than increase them.
This is where learners should be very careful not to let dramatic thinking take over, because seeing or hearing about military aircraft does not automatically mean danger. Just like seeing a police car driving slowly through a neighborhood does not mean a crime is happening, but often means the opposite, that authorities want to show presence and maintain calm, and this comparison can really help English learners understand why signaling is often about prevention and communication rather than preparation for violence.
Another important point to understand is the difference between intentions and assumptions, because intentions are what a country actually plans or wants to achieve, while assumptions are what observers think those actions mean, and in many cases, assumptions are shaped more by fear, past conflicts, or emotional headlines than by confirmed information, which is why experts always warn against interpreting routine signaling as a sign of immediate escalation without clear evidence.
Yes, and for learners, this distinction is very useful, not only for understanding global news, but also for learning English more clearly. Because words like signal, message, and gesture are often used metaphorically in news reports, and they do not mean physical attacks, but rather symbolic actions meant to communicate. So when you hear that a country is sending a signal, it usually means it is trying to influence behavior through visibility and awareness, not through force.
When we look at history, we can see that military signaling has been used many times to avoid conflict rather than start it, because showing presence can discourage risky behavior by making it clear that actions are being observed. And in this sense, aircraft patrols and deployments often function as stabilizing tools, especially in sensitive regions, where silence or absence could actually increase uncertainty and encourage dangerous misunderstandings between different actors.
This helps explain why signaling does not automatically lead to war, even though some people fear that it does. Because war usually involves clear steps such as public threats, emergency mobilizations, and the breakdown of diplomatic communication, while signaling often happens quietly alongside continued talks, routine operations, and normal international contact, which means that presence and communication are being used together to manage tension rather than let it grow.
So, when we ask whether aircraft movements are a warning signal, the most accurate answer is that they can be a form of communication, but communication does not mean confrontation, and in many cases, it actually shows an effort to manage situations responsibly by staying visible, predictable, and within international rules, which is very different from secretive or sudden actions that would indicate a real crisis.
For our listeners learning English, the most important takeaway here is to slow down when you hear serious news, listen for careful language, and remember that not every military movement is a step toward conflict, because understanding military messaging is about recognizing intention, context, and tone. And when you do that, global news becomes something you can understand calmly and confidently, instead of something that creates fear or confusion.
To balance our discussion properly, it is very important to understand that a large part of military activity around the world is routine, planned, and predictable, rather than reactive or emotional, because modern militaries operate on long schedules that are prepared months or even years in advance, covering training flights, patrol missions, and force rotations, all of which are designed to maintain readiness and safety, not to respond suddenly to daily political news or short-term events that appear in headlines.
Let me explain this in very simple everyday terms for our listeners, because military routines can be easier to understand when we compare them to normal life, since just like people go to work, exercise, or attend classes on fixed schedules, militaries also follow regular routines that help them stay prepared and organized, meaning that seeing aircraft in the sky is often similar to seeing buses on a timetable or workers arriving at an office, which is normal activity rather than a sign of emergency.
One of the most common routine activities is training flights, which are essential because pilots must regularly practice flying skills, navigation, communication, and coordination with other units, and these flights are carefully planned to take place in designated airspaces at scheduled times, often following the same routes repeatedly, so that crews stay proficient and aircraft systems are tested safely, ensuring that mistakes are avoided and operations remain controlled and professional.
For learners, it's helpful to think of training flights like driving lessons or practice exams, because people don't wait for a problem to appear before practicing. And in the same way, militaries train continuously, so they are ready if something unexpected happens, which means that training does not signal danger, but actually reduces risk, since prepared pilots and well-maintained aircraft make misunderstandings and accidents far less likely.
Another routine activity is patrol missions, which involve aircraft flying over certain areas regularly to observe conditions, support maritime safety, and maintain awareness of what is happening in the region. And these patrols usually follow strict rules, remain within international airspace, and coordinate closely with allies, making them predictable and transparent rather than secretive, which is why experts often see patrols as stabilizing actions rather than provocative ones.
This is very similar to how security cameras or neighborhood patrols work in daily life, because their purpose is not to scare people, but to make situations visible and orderly. And when learners understand patrols this way, it becomes easier to see that routine military presence is often about prevention and observation, not about preparation for conflict or sudden aggressive action.
Rotation of forces is another key routine that often attracts attention without being fully understood, because military personnel and equipment are regularly rotated in and out of regions to prevent fatigue, maintain efficiency, and share responsibilities among units. And these rotations are planned long before they happen, meaning that aircraft movements linked to rotation are logistical rather than political, focused on organization instead of confrontation.
To make this clearer, we can compare force rotation to shift changes at a hospital or factory, where one group finishes its duty and another takes over, ensuring continuity without disruption. And this comparison helps learners understand that movement does not always mean escalation, but often reflects careful management of people and resources to keep operations smooth and sustainable.
Scheduled exercises are also a major part of routine military behavior, because they allow different units and allied countries to practice working together, test communication systems, and improve coordination. And these exercises are usually announced in advance, planned according to international rules, and repeated regularly, which means they are predictable events rather than spontaneous responses to political tension or breaking news.
For English learners, this is a good moment to remember that the word exercise in military language does not mean physical fitness only, but practice and preparation, similar to rehearsal before a performance. And understanding this vocabulary helps listeners interpret news more accurately without adding unnecessary fear or drama to what is often a normal, scheduled activity.
All of these routine activities share one important characteristic, which is predictability, because predictability reduces misunderstandings and allows other countries to recognize what is normal behavior. And when actions follow established patterns, experts can easily distinguish routine operations from unusual activity, which is why many analysts remain calm when they see aircraft movements that match long-standing schedules and operational habits.
This predictability is actually comforting when we think about it carefully, because just like regular routines in daily life help people feel stable and organized, predictable military behavior helps regions remain calmer. And for learners, understanding this idea makes global news feel less confusing and more logical, especially when headlines try to make routine movements sound dramatic.
So, when we ask whether aircraft activity is routine, the answer often lies in planning, scheduling, and repetition, because routine movements follow known patterns, involve familiar aircraft types, and occur within existing frameworks, which is very different from crisis actions that are sudden, clearly announced, and accompanied by urgent political statements or emergency measures.
The most important lesson for our listeners is that not every movement is a message, and not every presence is a warning, because many military activities happen simply because organizations rely on structure and routine to function properly. And when learners understand this, they can listen to global news with more confidence, better vocabulary awareness, and a calmer mindset.
When we discuss how Iran perceives U.S. military aircraft operating near its region, it is essential to remember that perspective does not equal accusation, and describing it objectively can help learners understand international relations more clearly, because Iran, like any other country, observes nearby military movements through the lens of national security and self-protection, and for Iranian officials, aircraft in the vicinity are often seen as signals that require careful monitoring, planning, and internal discussion, without immediately assuming hostile intent, as understanding context and intent is crucial to avoid misunderstandings.
That's right, Adam. And for learners, it's useful to think of this as noticing a neighbour's activity. If someone builds a new fence or installs cameras, you might pay attention and adjust your own plans. But it doesn't mean they are trying to harm you. And similarly, Iran's government observes aircraft movements as information that requires awareness, preparation, and strategic consideration, rather than automatically interpreting them as a direct threat, which is an important distinction for learners to understand when following international news.
In practice, this perspective translates into heightened surveillance, military readiness, and strategic analysis, because Iranian military planners want to ensure the safety of their country, its airspace, and its economic routes, and by monitoring aircraft carefully, they can determine whether operations are routine, part of scheduled exercises, or indicate a change in regional posture. And this careful observation allows them to respond proportionately and avoid escalation, which is a common approach in many countries when foreign military forces are active near their borders or territories.
And from a learning perspective, Adam, this helps us see the vocabulary in action. Words like observe, monitor, and respond proportionately are key phrases used in news about international relations, and they do not mean attack or conflict. Instead, they describe careful attention and preparation, which is a neutral and respectful way to understand another country's actions without assigning blame, allowing learners to practice understanding nuanced English in real-world contexts.
Another important factor is regional security concerns, which include protecting shipping lanes, critical infrastructure, and international trade routes, because Iran sits in a strategic location that connects many parts of the world, and aircraft activity nearby can trigger increased attention to ensure that no mistakes occur, that all legal and international agreements are respected, and that any potential miscommunications are minimized, which helps reduce risk and demonstrates a measured, defensive approach rather than an aggressive one.
For learners, this concept is similar to checking traffic on a busy street before making a turn. Just as drivers observe other vehicles to prevent accidents, countries monitor neighbouring activity to maintain safety, and understanding this analogy can help listeners grasp why Iranian observers may focus on aircraft movements without assuming immediate hostility, making international news easier to interpret in plain English.
It is also important to note that Iran's response to U.S. military activity is often communicated through official statements, public reporting, and controlled demonstrations of capability, because nations tend to share their perspective in measured ways to avoid misunderstandings, maintain credibility with both domestic and international audiences, and emphasize that their actions are defensive and responsible. And this measured communication is an example of how countries balance awareness with diplomacy, which is crucial for maintaining regional stability.
Exactly, Adam. And when we say measured communication, learners can understand it as speaking or acting carefully to avoid conflict, similar to how a teacher or manager might address a sensitive situation at work, which highlights how respectful language and neutral wording are used in official reporting to maintain calm and avoid escalating tension while still sharing important information.
From a neutral standpoint, understanding Iran's perspective is not about agreeing or disagreeing with their viewpoint, but about recognizing that all countries have interests, concerns, and security priorities that guide their interpretation of foreign military presence, and in this case, aircraft near Iran are interpreted as information that requires planning and attention, rather than as immediate aggression, because learning to separate perspective from judgment is a key step in analyzing international news and building a balanced understanding of complex situations.
And this is where English learners can benefit greatly. because following multiple viewpoints encourages careful listening and vocabulary comprehension, especially with words like perspective, interpretation, priority, and observation, which often appear in political and news reporting. And understanding these words allows listeners to read, listen, and discuss global news without jumping to conclusions or making assumptions based on emotion or incomplete information.
Finally, it is essential to remember that observing, monitoring, and preparing does not automatically escalate a situation. Instead, it provides countries like Iran with the tools to respond appropriately if something unusual occurs, and by paying close attention to movements, schedules, and patterns, they can distinguish between routine operations, scheduled exercises, or genuinely concerning activity, and this careful assessment reduces mistakes, builds confidence in decision-making, and supports stability, which is why military analysts emphasize the importance of context and proportionality in understanding regional dynamics.
So, for learners, the main takeaway is to respect multiple perspectives and understand that different countries may view the same event in different ways based on their history, geography, and security priorities. And by approaching news with curiosity and care, listeners can expand vocabulary, improve comprehension, and gain insight into the reasoning behind international behavior, all while practicing neutral, respectful English that is appropriate for discussion and analysis.
In summary, understanding Iran's perspective is not about assigning blame, creating fear, or taking sides, but about seeing how a responsible government interprets foreign activity near its borders, considers national and regional security, communicates officially, and balances observation with caution. And this type of analysis is exactly what helps learners develop both English skills and a thoughtful approach to global news, which will prepare them for more complex discussions in the following sections of our podcast. When we discuss the role of media and social media in shaping perception, it is crucial to understand that headlines are often designed to attract attention quickly, which can sometimes make routine events appear more dramatic than they really are, because media outlets need to capture viewers' or readers' interest immediately. And as a result, phrases like U.S. aircraft near Iran sparks tension may be technically accurate, but do not always reflect the careful, factual context behind the movements. And this is why critical thinking is essential for listeners who want to understand news calmly and accurately.
For learners, this is a great time to highlight some useful vocabulary. Words like headline, coverage, viral, and perception are commonly used in news reporting and social media, and understanding them helps you read articles or watch videos more carefully. A headline is the title of a news story that aims to summarize the key point quickly, while perception means how people interpret or understand an event, and recognizing that perception can differ from fact is very important for avoiding misunderstanding.
Social media plays a unique role in shaping how people interpret events because videos, images, or posts can go viral within minutes, often without proper verification, and this rapid sharing can exaggerate the importance of routine or scheduled military activity, creating the impression that an unusual or aggressive event is happening when, in reality, it may be a normal patrol, a training flight, or a rotation of forces that occurs regularly, which is why it is essential to question information and verify the source before drawing conclusions.
To put this in simpler terms, think of social media like a rumor spreading among friends. One person shares a dramatic story, another adds more detail without checking, and soon everyone believes something bigger than it really is. This analogy helps learners understand why a short video clip of aircraft flying in the sky does not automatically mean a crisis is occurring, and it encourages careful observation and analysis rather than immediate emotional reaction.
One effective strategy for questioning information is to compare multiple sources, ideally those that are reputable, official, and fact-checked, because reliable news agencies often provide more detailed context, including flight type, location, and timing. while social media posts may omit these details or present partial information, which can mislead viewers. And by learning to cross-check information, listeners not only improve their understanding of global events, but also develop critical thinking skills that are essential for interpreting news accurately in English.
Here, English learners can also pick up some important vocabulary like source, verify, fact-checked, and context. A source is where information comes from. Verify means to check if something is true, and context is the background information that helps explain why something happened. By practicing these words, learners can improve both comprehension and confidence when reading or listening to news about complex topics like military activity.
Another point to consider is that viral videos often remove scale, timing, and pattern from the story, because short clips rarely include information about whether aircraft activity is routine, part of an exercise, or happening in international airspace. And this lack of context can amplify fear or confusion among viewers who do not have background knowledge, which is why educational podcasts like ours are important, as they provide step-by-step explanation, clear vocabulary, and neutral perspective that helps listeners interpret information responsibly.
Exactly, Adam. And learners should understand that social media exaggeration is not always intentional. Sometimes it happens because people are excited, curious, or unaware of all the facts. Words like viral and exaggeration are very common in media discussions. Viral means widely shared in a short time, while exaggeration means making something seem bigger or more important than it really is. And knowing these words helps learners recognize when a story may be emotionally charged rather than fact-based.
It is also important to distinguish between opinion and fact when consuming media, because many articles, videos, or social media posts mix analysis, commentary, and personal interpretation with reporting, and this can influence perception even if the facts themselves are routine or non-threatening. By focusing on factual reporting and carefully considering language used in headlines, such as words like sparks concern or could escalate, learners can identify subtle signals of opinion versus confirmed information, and this critical skill is invaluable for accurate comprehension and calm interpretation of global news.
Learners should also pay attention to phrases like sources say or according to officials, which usually indicate that the information has some verification, whereas phrases like it seems or people claim may show that it is an opinion or unverified claim. Practicing these distinctions in English helps listeners improve not only comprehension, but also confidence in discussing global events, because they can separate what is factual from what is speculation and avoid overreacting to sensationalized stories.
Finally, understanding media literacy and social media influence encourages learners to adopt a calm, reflective approach rather than being swept away by dramatic headlines or viral posts. Because by asking questions like, who reported this? Is this routine? And what is the context? Listeners can interpret military activity thoughtfully, improve English vocabulary in real situations, and develop critical thinking skills that will help them navigate not only news about U.S. aircraft near Iran, but also many other complex topics in world affairs safely and responsibly.
So, the main takeaway for learners is to read carefully, check sources, understand vocabulary like headline, perception, viral, context, and verify, and maintain calm when following news. By combining these skills, you can learn English effectively while building awareness of how media and social media shape public understanding, which is essential for responsible news consumption and balanced comprehension of international events.
In summary, while media and social media have the power to shape perception quickly and dramatically, learners can respond by using critical thinking, focusing on reliable sources, and understanding language choices in reporting. This section teaches you not only how to improve English comprehension, but also how to interpret global events safely, calmly, and accurately, preparing you for the next part of our discussion, where we analyze the difference between routine activity and potential signals of tension in detail. When experts analyze military activity to determine whether it might lead to conflict, they look for a combination of very specific signs rather than jumping to conclusions based only on presence. Because routine operations like patrols, training flights, or rotations often occur without any intention of creating tension, and by observing patterns, communications, and the scale of activity, analysts can identify whether movements are strategic, precautionary, or part of standard readiness measures, which helps separate ordinary presence from actual preparation for escalation in a way that is logical, cautious, and educational for learners.
For learners, it's useful to think of this like watching traffic. Just because a lot of cars are on the road does not mean there is an accident. But if you see flashing lights, sirens, or cars suddenly changing direction, that signals something unusual might be happening. Similarly, experts watch for unusual movements, sudden changes in patterns, or increased coordination with diplomacy, because these signs indicate that more than routine activity might be occurring. And understanding this distinction helps learners interpret news accurately and reduces unnecessary fear.
Some of the most important signs experts watch include changes in communication, mobilization of additional forces, increased intelligence activity, or coordination among allies, because these factors suggest that a country is preparing for potential scenarios, not merely maintaining normal readiness. And by analyzing these indicators over time, specialists can assess the likelihood of escalation without relying on headlines, speculation, or dramatic social media coverage, which makes expert analysis a measured, fact-based approach rather than an emotional or speculative one.
It is also important for learners to note the difference between presence and preparation, because presence usually refers to visible, routine actions that follow predictable schedules, such as patrols or exercises, while preparation involves deliberate changes in deployment, communication, or strategy that indicate planning for a possible crisis. And knowing this distinction is critical for avoiding panic and understanding news vocabulary like mobilization, deployment, coordination, and intelligence, which frequently appear in reporting about international security.
Another key aspect that experts consider is the role of diplomacy alongside military activity, because even when forces are deployed, active negotiations, communications, and public statements often continue to reduce tension and maintain international stability. And this combination of observation and diplomacy is a strong indicator that routine presence is not automatically a sign of conflict, teaching learners that in global affairs, action and dialogue work together to prevent misunderstandings and maintain security rather than provoke escalation.
For English learners, this teaches us an important point about language. Words like escalation, diplomacy, and coordination may sound serious, but they describe processes designed to manage situations calmly, and by understanding the meaning and context of these words, learners can follow news stories confidently, recognize measured government action, and distinguish between routine operations and genuine crises, all while practicing vocabulary that is directly relevant to international affairs.
Experts also examine timing, frequency, and pattern changes in military movements, because sudden deviations from routine can indicate a shift in strategy or heightened alertness, while ongoing, consistent patterns usually point to normal operational behavior. And this careful, data-driven approach allows analysts to provide guidance and assessment to policymakers, journalists, and the public, reinforcing the importance of patience, observation, and evidence-based interpretation instead of assumptions or immediate fear.
This perspective is reassuring for learners because it shows that the world is rarely as chaotic as it may seem from headlines or viral posts. When analysts focus on measured indicators rather than presence alone, we see that most routine activity is just that, routine, and understanding these expert methods can improve learners' ability to interpret English news expand their vocabulary, and gain confidence in discussing global events without anxiety, which is exactly the goal of this podcast.
Finally, it is important to emphasize that expert analysis is not about predicting the future or creating sensational stories, but about observing facts, patterns, and behaviors over time. Because this measured approach helps distinguish between normal readiness, precautionary measures, and actions that may truly indicate tension. And by learning how analysts differentiate between these situations, listeners can develop critical thinking, reduce fear, and follow complex topics in English confidently, reinforcing both comprehension and calm reasoning.
So, learners, the main takeaway from this section is that not every military movement signals danger. Experts look for context, patterns, communication, and coordination before interpreting activity as preparation for conflict. By focusing on learning vocabulary like escalation, mobilization, diplomacy, and coordination, and by understanding how experts separate routine from crisis, you can interpret news accurately, maintain calm, and build confidence in your English listening and comprehension skills while exploring real-world international events.
In summary, understanding what experts usually look for before real escalation helps learners see that international news often involves measured, deliberate actions rather than spontaneous danger. Recognizing patterns, distinguishing presence from preparation, and observing diplomacy are key skills not only for following global events responsibly, but also for learning English in a safe, educational, and practical context, which prepares listeners for deeper discussions in the next sections of our podcast. When we explore topics like U.S. aircraft movements near Iran, it is important for English learners to see how real-world events can be a valuable tool for learning language, because discussing global news gives listeners exposure to advanced vocabulary, formal reporting structures, and sentence patterns that are often not found in textbooks. And by focusing on current events, learners practice comprehension, listening, and speaking skills in a meaningful context, while simultaneously staying informed about the world, which makes language learning practical, relevant, and engaging at the same time.
Exactly, Adam. And for learners, this means you are not just memorizing words or grammar rules, but actually using English to understand complex ideas and communicate about them. Words like presence, routine, escalation, diplomacy, and coordination have real-life applications in news, discussions, and academic settings. And learning these words through stories about global events helps them stick in your memory, improves your ability to describe situations accurately, and builds confidence in expressing your opinions and questions in English.
Another benefit is listening comprehension, because following podcasts, news clips, or discussions about international events helps learners train their ears to understand different accents, sentence structures, and specialized vocabulary. And by hearing words repeated in context, learners can pick up pronunciation, intonation, and subtle language cues naturally, which accelerates fluency and understanding, making it easier to follow other English media sources, participate in discussions, and read news articles with greater confidence.
And this is very motivating for learners, because when you see that you can understand what is happening in the world in English, it increases both your confidence and interest. You are learning practical skills while staying informed, and this combination makes the learning process more meaningful. It also helps you talk about global events with friends, classmates, or online communities, using vocabulary and sentence structures that are accurate and professional, which reinforces progress and motivates you to keep practicing.
Another point to emphasize is comprehension of complex ideas, because analyzing international events requires learners to think critically about cause, effect, and perspective, which strengthens cognitive skills while improving English. Understanding how to distinguish routine movements from potential escalation, how media shapes perception, and how different countries interpret events trains learners to follow arguments, identify key points, and summarize information clearly, which are essential skills for academic, professional, and personal communication in English.
For learners, this also provides an opportunity to practice respectful and neutral language, which is very important when discussing sensitive topics. Words like perspective, interpretation, observation, and analysis help you explain viewpoints without creating misunderstanding, while phrases like "it appears," according to experts, or "reports indicate," allow you to share information responsibly. Practicing these expressions improves both spoken and written English and prepares learners to discuss news calmly, clearly, and confidently.
Learning through current events also enhances cultural awareness, because topics like military movements, diplomacy, and international policy introduce learners to different ways countries interact, think, and make decisions. By exploring these situations in English, learners not only improve language skills, but also develop a deeper understanding of global issues, which is valuable for conversations, debates, and even professional contexts. And it reinforces the idea that language learning is not isolated from real-world knowledge, but fully connected to it.
Another exciting benefit is that learners can practice both speaking and writing by summarizing what they hear, expressing their own opinions, and asking questions in English. For example, after listening to our podcast, learners can try to explain in their own words what military signaling means, how routine operations differ from potential escalation, or how social media shapes perception. This kind of practice strengthens vocabulary, sentence structure, and overall fluency while encouraging learners to think critically and communicate effectively.
Furthermore, using topics like this helps learners improve not just passive understanding, but active engagement. By discussing real events, learners train themselves to respond to questions, clarify information, and participate in conversations, which is crucial for building confidence in English. It also encourages curiosity and independent research, as learners may want to explore more about global events, compare sources, or read news articles in English, which further reinforces both language development and knowledge about the world.
Finally, the most important takeaway for learners is motivation and progress. By following podcasts like this, learners can see how far they have come, recognize new words, understand complex sentences, and feel confident discussing international topics in English. Each step of comprehension, each new expression, and each improved listening skill builds a foundation for lifelong learning, helping learners approach news, conversations, and studies with confidence, curiosity, and the ability to use English effectively in real-life situations.
In summary, analyzing topics like U.S. aircraft near Iran is not just about understanding global events. It is also about learning English in a meaningful, practical, and engaging way. Learners gain vocabulary, improve listening comprehension, practice speaking and writing, understand complex ideas, and develop critical thinking skills. By using real news as a learning tool, you combine language growth with world awareness, making your English stronger, more confident, and more applicable in everyday life.
So, learners, remember that each episode is a chance to practice English through real-world topics. You are improving vocabulary, comprehension, critical thinking, and communication skills while learning about international events. Celebrate your progress, stay curious, and keep practicing, because every step you take strengthens your ability to understand and discuss the world in English confidently. Learning this way is both educational and empowering, and it prepares you for more advanced conversations in English every day.
As we reach the conclusion of today's episode, let's take a moment to summarize the main ideas clearly, so that learners can review and remember what we discussed. We began by exploring the recent U.S. military aircraft movements near Iran and explained the context, emphasizing that not every movement signals conflict, and that understanding geography, routine operations, and military patterns is crucial for interpreting news accurately, which helps learners improve English while following real-world events safely and responsibly.
Exactly, Adam. For learners, it is helpful to remember that this episode was designed to teach English through current events. We introduced important vocabulary such as presence, routine, escalation, diplomacy, observation, and coordination. And we explored how media, social media, and official statements shape perception, all in a neutral and educational context. By connecting language learning with real news, learners can practice comprehension and speaking skills effectively.
We also explained the difference between routine military activity, such as patrols, training flights, and force rotations, and actions that might indicate potential escalation, highlighting that experts watch for multiple indicators, including communication patterns, mobilization, and diplomatic activity, before interpreting events as signals of tension. This analysis encourages learners to question headlines, verify sources, and separate perception from fact, which is a key skill in both English learning and understanding global affairs.
Yes, Adam. And learners should also remember the value of seeing situations from multiple perspectives. We discussed how Iran might interpret nearby military activity as information to monitor and plan carefully, without assuming aggression. And we emphasized the importance of neutral language when discussing sensitive topics, which teaches learners both vocabulary and respectful ways to explain viewpoints in English, building confidence in conversation and comprehension.
Another critical point is how media and social media shape perception. We showed that headlines can exaggerate routine movements, viral videos may create confusion, and unverified reports should always be approached carefully. Learners were introduced to practical vocabulary for this context, including headline, perception, verify, source, and context, which will help them read, listen, and discuss international news critically, calmly, and accurately in English.
And we also highlighted how following expert analysis can reduce fear and misinformation. Experts differentiate between routine presence and preparation for potential escalation by monitoring patterns, communication, and diplomacy. For learners, understanding this teaches that news should be interpreted carefully, improves listening comprehension, and reinforces the habit of analyzing information thoughtfully, which is essential for both English learning and global awareness.
Importantly, learners should see that analyzing this topic serves multiple educational purposes. Listening to this podcast helps practice comprehension, reinforces new vocabulary, teaches sentence structures used in real news, and encourages critical thinking. By following a structured, step-by-step explanation of events, learners can gradually build confidence in reading, listening, speaking, and discussing complex topics in English without feeling overwhelmed or confused.
Finally, learners, we want to encourage you to continue practicing English daily through real-world topics. Each new episode, news article, or discussion is an opportunity to expand vocabulary, strengthen comprehension, and improve confidence. Remember that language learning is a gradual process, and by engaging with meaningful, neutral, and educational content like today's episode, you can combine knowledge of world events with practical English skills, making your learning journey both informative and enjoyable.
In closing, we want to remind listeners that this episode is entirely educational and neutral. Our goal was to explain the context of U.S. aircraft activity near Iran, introduce relevant vocabulary, and demonstrate how to analyze news critically without creating fear or assigning blame. Following these principles ensures that learners can use English to understand global events responsibly, maintain curiosity, and build confidence in their language abilities, while exploring real-world topics safely.
Thank you for staying with us, everyone. We hope you enjoyed learning English through today's topic, and that you found it both interesting and informative. Keep practicing, stay curious about the world, and remember that every time you listen, read, or speak about current events in English, you are improving your skills and building confidence. Keep moving forward on your English learning journey. We're proud of your progress and excited for you to continue.
That's right, Julia. And for all our listeners, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and leave your comments sharing your thoughts and questions about today's topic. Your support helps us create more educational content, and by participating, you are also practicing English in a practical and meaningful way. Thank you for learning with us today.
See you next time, learners. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep practicing English with curiosity and confidence. Every step you take brings you closer to mastering the language and understanding the world better.